Hi folks, welcome to another historical story here at Wookey Hole Caves. Today I'm going to talk about cave diving. We're standing in Chamber 3, which is called also the Witch's Parlour. And over here, just over here on my torchlight, this small gap is the top of an arch leading into a cave from here underwater. Now this cave is the site of the very first ever recorded cave dive, and cave diving began here in July 1935. Now, when they came down here, the divers were given sea diving. So these guys were wearing heavy boots, the brass helmets. A company from London lent them this equipment. They practiced for a few days in some ponds not very far from here, and then they came down to the caves for real. Now, there were 6 cavers, and these cavers, who became divers very quickly, came down to here to make the first recorded dive on the 14th of July 1935. They were given permission by the owner, Gerard Hodgkinson, but they had to dive out of visitor hours. So they were in here between usually midnight and maybe 6 o'clock in the morning. Now the first dive, Graham Balcombe walked from where I'm standing into the water and under the arch on the far side. Now these divers were connected to a big hand pump. Over here to my right, there would have been a big wooden hand pump operated by 2 people. The 2 people had to listen out to the cave, the diver, how quickly he was breathing, and they had to pump air in time with the breathing. And to see where they were going, these divers had actually waterproofed someone's car headlights and then attached a waterproof cable running back to a car battery. So when they walked, these divers were carrying a car headlight to allow them to see where they were going. Now, Balcombe went in first. He went in just after midnight to walk from where I'm standing under the water, which is about 6 meters deep in the middle, and the arch is about 4. To go into Chamber 4 and come back to here took him about half an hour. The second diver was called Penelope Powell. Her nickname was Mossy Powell, and she left from here at about 2 in the morning. And again, it took her roughly half an hour. And the third diver, going in here at 3 o'clock in the morning, was a diver called Frank Frost. Now, Penelope Powell also worked for Wookey Hole Caves, and we have an ice cream parlour on site here. Back in 1935, that building, which is still original, was actually where she worked. She was the manageress of what was then the gift shop and the museum. To my right is a plaque to that first cave dive. On there it says, first cave dive ever in this country on the 14th of July 1935 by Graham Balcombe and Penelope Powell. Now those 2 divers were 2 of 6 divers. The 4 other divers that dived here every weekend with them were called Bill Bufton, Bill Tucknott, Digger Harris and Frank Frost. Now between them, over the weeks they were here, they made their way further and further up the caves, discovering as far as Chamber 7. But in between that, the divers actually were involved in a live radio broadcast. So on the 17th of August, the BBC came down to the caves here at Wookey Hole, and a live broadcast was made as the divers made their way further and further up the caves from here. Now this had been done before. They had a live broadcast here in the early 1930s. The local male voice choir from the Wookey Hole paper mill here actually sang in here, and that was transmitted live. So they knew it worked. So on the date, 17th of August, in here you'd have all the members of the BBC, the 6 divers, and a man called Frank Brown. Now Frank Brown was the general manager of Wookey Hole. He didn't own the caves, that was Gerard Hodgkinson, but Frank Brown ran the caves on a day-to-day basis. He had a few months earlier started helping the divers when they were practicing above ground in the ponds, and he also got involved in some of the archaeology work, and that's how really he got to help them here. Now his job was to talk on the telephone. The telephone was linked to the divers, and Balcombe was actually, his day job was telecommunications. So in the first and second transmission, you would had Frank Brown sitting here at a table, all the members of the BBC around here walking around whilst the transmissions took place, okay? The first one happened at 10:30, and that was whilst Balcombe and Powell made it from Chambers 4 through to Chambers 5, describing what they'd seen. And the second transmission at 11:30 was again what they were seeing as they walked from chambers 5 to chambers number 6. Now the thing about the transmission was the pumps, the hand pumps that were used to pump air into the diving suits. They were very, very noisy. And so whilst the divers talked for, let's say, 20 seconds, they had actually no air supply because otherwise it was too noisy in the background. Now there is a story that at the end of the second transmission, Balcombe shouts out to the guys back here in the third chamber, "Man on the pumps," and nothing happens. He repeats his request, "Man on the pumps," and again nothing happens. Then he says it for a third time, and then allegedly he uses the word that perhaps he shouldn't have used. At that point, the music from a modern day gets brought over, the program finishes, and nobody really knows what's happened to the divers. They do have lots of phone calls into the BBC asking if the divers are okay. They were, but as I say, it was just used because perhaps he used a word he shouldn't have used back in those days. Now this chamber was originally the end in the show cave. The divers obviously go in further up the river from here. Just under 50 years ago, the first tunnel was put through. So when you guys visit Wookey Hole Caves today, you are able to go and see some of the caves discovered by the divers. All the caves you see through these tunnels we have here were found by divers originally going that way beneath the arch in Chamber 4. And the first cave you're going to see through the tunnel here is Chamber 7. Chamber 7 being the cave where the expedition of 1935 got to in just 6 weekends. Okay, so this is Chamber 7. Chamber 7, when you visit, is the next chamber after you leave Chamber 3. The water down here, this is where Balcombe and Powell would have surfaced. This is a few weeks later, so this is September 1935. So you had 2 oil drums, a rope ladder in effect attached to that, and both Balcombe and Powell could then climb out in the heavy sea diving to take their first view of this chamber. You can read all the details because all this was recorded in the logbook of the 1935 diving here. And they also talk about this over here to my left. They, looking up with their torchlight from beneath, they see this big, big white expanse of flowstone and stalagmite here, coloured by iron. And they describe this as one of the most incredible things they've seen and the reason why, you know, they spent the 6 weekends here diving at Wookey Hole Caves. So when you leave Chamber 8 today on the gantry, you walk around the corner and you see this in front of you. This water here, this is a sump of chamber number 9. It's called 9.1, and this is where the cave was discovered by the divers. Now this cave was found in April 1948. One of the divers was, again, Graham Balcombe. The main difference with this chamber, though, was the divers were still bottom walking, like they had done on the early dives, but they were now not connected by hose pipes. They had a self-contained rebreather, which meant it was a lot, in some regards, easier than being tied to a hose pipe. And as I say, they would have surfaced down here in front of us. The river itself does take a turn over here when my torch goes under here. The river is coming from another piece of water around the corner in Chamber 9, which we'll see. And just above the water, this bridge and rope system is part of the Wild Wookey that we now do here at Wookey Hole Caves, an adventure caving you can do here. So walking round from the first sump, over here on my left, down beneath me, you have what is called the second sump, or 9.2, here in Chamber 9. The water itself, when you look down, is actually flowing. It is hard to tell, but what you have is the rivers flowing this way, back around to the other sump you first saw when you walked into this chamber. And this piece of water is where today, and for the last 40 years, modern divers now start from. This is the point where the divers can, from here, go presently about 1.5 miles up the river.